The night Mae Harding found the dying man behind Harmon's Inn, she was supposed to be taking out the trash. Wind off the Rockies, October cold. The kind that gets into your bones before you know it's there. She heard him before she saw him. Not a cry, not a call for help. Just a sound a man makes when he's trying very hard not to make any sound at all. He was on his side in the brush. Good coat, tall boots. And at his hip a holster. The leather strap cut clean through. Recent. In his fist clenched white knuckle tight, a scrap of dark blue fabric. She knew that color. Her husband had worn it his last morning alive. Mae crouched down in the frozen dirt, put her hand on the stranger's shoulder, felt him go rigid. Somewhere above her a light moved behind Ruth Harmon's office window. She didn't look up. The wind came down off the Rockies mean and early that October, the kind of cold that didn't ask permission before it got into your bones. Mae Harding felt it through the back door of Harmon's Inn, the moment she stepped outside, the wooden door swinging shut behind her with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, the kind of sky that meant business. She was carrying the slop bucket again. Because that was the shape of her days now. Slop bucket in the morning, slop bucket after the lunch crowd, slop bucket at the end of the night when her feet ached so bad she couldn't tell where the cold ended and the pain began. 2 years of this. 2 years since Roy went down into Shaft 4 with his lunch pail and his flannel shirt, and his habit of whistling something tuneless when he thought nobody could hear. 2 years since the ground swallowed him up along with 7 other men and a lie that the whole territory seemed willing to keep. She dumped the bucket, watched the gray water spread across the frozen dirt and disappear. Don't think about Roy, not tonight. Tonight she had tables to wipe down and a stove to bank and a floor that wasn't going to sweep itself. She picked up the empty bucket and turned back toward the door. That was when she heard it, not loud. Not the kind of sound that made you stop walking. More like the sound a man makes when he's trying very hard not to make any sound at all. A low catch of breath from the direction of the brush line behind the livery stable. The kind of sound that meant something was wrong in the way things went wrong out here, where the law was 3 hours away on a good horse and bad decisions had a way of finding their feet. Mae stood still, listened. There it was again. Every part of her with good sense said to go back inside. Close the door, bank the stove, go to sleep. This was Wyoming territory in 1882. And a woman alone in the dark behind a livery had no business investigating strange sounds from the brush. She walked toward it anyway. The light from the inn's back window only stretched so far, past the woodpile, past the rain barrel, into the space where the sagebrush grew thick along the edge of the dry wash. The dry wash that cut behind the property and ran north toward the foothills. That space was dark in the specific way that places get dark when the moon hasn't risen yet, and the clouds have come in low. But she saw the shape of him, because you couldn't miss it once you were close enough. A man on his side in the brush, one arm tucked wrong beneath him, and she could hear him breathing now, shallow and careful, the way a person breathes when breathing itself costs something. Mae crouched down, set the bucket aside without looking away from him. The light from the inn window caught on details. The cut of his coat. Not cheap, not a drifter's coat. Heavy hide coat, the kind of thing you wore when you meant to be outside for days at a time. Good tall boots on his feet, the leather dark and worn but not broken down, and at his right hip a holster, the leather cut clean. Not worn through, not old damage. Cut, recent, the kind of cut you made when you were taking something off a man in a hurry and didn't care about the strap. And his right hand. His fist was closed so tight the knuckles had gone pale even in the bad light. Clenched around something. A scrap of fabric, dark-colored, though she couldn't make out the shade. Mae reached out and put her hand on his shoulder, felt him go rigid under her palm. Still conscious then, good, scared of her or unable to speak, one of the two. "You're behind Harmon's Inn," she said, keeping her voice low and level. "Not kind, exactly, just informational. My name is Mae Harding. I work here. I'm not going to hurt you." He turned his head, just enough to see her. His eyes were open, dark in the low light, though she couldn't say what color. His face was cut along the left temple, dried blood tracking down his jaw like a line drawn by something with no patience. He was maybe 10 years older than her, maybe less. Hard to say with a face carrying that much damage. He looked at her for a long moment, then the bag, on my right side. "Is it still there?" Not a question, a test. Mae looked at his right hip without moving the rest of her. The bag he meant was a flat leather pouch tucked inside his coat, Half hidden, she could see the edge of it. Still there, she said. Something in him let go. Not all the way, but enough that she could feel the difference through her palm. All right. His voice came out rough, scraped down to the wood. All right. She needed to get him inside before the cold finished what whoever had cut that gun strap started. She could feel it in the air now. That particular drop in temperature that came right before the night got serious. His coat was good, but he'd been lying on frozen ground for long enough that his color was wrong. Gray around the mouth, not the gray of the sky. Worse. Can you stand? She said. I can try, then try. It took longer than she would have liked. She got her shoulder under his right arm, felt him take the weight onto her. Heard the sound he didn't quite manage to keep inside when she helped him up. Ribs. At least one, maybe two. The kind of thing you didn't do to a man by accident. He stood, swayed once, stayed up. They went across the yard slow, Mae watching the windows of the inn. One light in Ruth Harmon's office on the second floor, otherwise dark. The kitchen door, inside. The smell of wood smoke and old grease and something that had been soup once and was now mostly memory. The storage room at the back of the kitchen. She'd put a man in there before, a traveler who'd come through in a January storm 3 years ago, who could barely lift his head. Ruth hadn't known about that one either. Mae pushed the door open with her boot, got them both through it, found the nail where the extra lamp hung and lit it low. She sat him down on the pile of grain sacks in the corner and took her first real look at him. Tall, even sitting. Wide through the shoulders in a way that wasn't just the coat. His hands, when he finally let the right one open, were big and scarred at the knuckles in the way of a man who'd spent serious time outdoors doing serious work. The cut on his temple had stopped bleeding sometime in the last hour, but it would need cleaning. His ribs on the left side, she suspected, but she wasn't going to go prodding at a stranger in the dark to confirm it. And in his open palm, still half curled around it, a scrap of fabric, dark blue, a very particular shade of dark blue. The color of the vest the company men wore when they worked for Boyd Dent's operation. Mae looked at it, looked at him, did not say anything yet. Rafe Cole, he said, like she'd asked. Maybe she had and forgot. She hadn't asked. Mae Harding. She went to the shelf above the door, where she kept the small medicine kit she'd put together over 2 years of dealing with kitchen burns and splinters, and the occasional drunk who'd taken a header off the porch. Carbolic solution. Clean cloth. The small bottle of whiskey she kept there and had never once used for drinking. You know this place well enough to find that in the dark, he said. I live here. You own it. I work here. She brought the things to the grain sacks and crouched in front of him. Hold still. He held still. She cleaned the cut on his temple, felt him breathing careful and controlled the whole time, not pulling away but not exactly easy about it either. The kind of man who was accustomed to managing his own pain privately, and found having someone else near it uncomfortable, in a way that had nothing to do with the pain. When she was done, he said, "Nobody saw you bring me in." "Not yet. You should keep it that way." She sat back on her heels and looked at him straight. "I'll decide what I should do. You can tell me why." He looked at her for a moment. The lamp was low enough that she couldn't read his face fully, but she got the outline of it. A man who weighed things before he gave them away. Not secretive, exactly. Just careful in the way of someone who'd learned that being otherwise cost you. "There are people in this territory who'd rather I not make it to tomorrow morning," he said, "because of what's in the bag." He paused, just slightly. "Yes, Boyd Dent's people." The pause this time was longer. "What makes you say that?" Mae reached out and touched the scrap of dark blue fabric still in his palm. Didn't take it, just touched it. "My husband wore that color his last day of work," she said. So 2 years ago, October. The silence in the storage room had weight to it after that. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere and threw shadows up the walls. Outside, the wind picked up against the back of the building, and Mae could hear the sign above the inn's front door swinging on its chain. "Roy Harding," he said finally. She went absolutely still. He said it like a man confirming something he already knew, not like a question. And the fact that he knew it. The fact that her husband's name came out of this man's mouth in this storage room at this hour did something to the air in Mae's chest that she couldn't immediately name. Not grief, something older than grief. The thing that lives on the other side of grief once you've been carrying it long enough. "How do you know his name?" she said. Her voice came out flat, not angry, flat. Rafe Cole looked down at the scrap of fabric in his hand. "I have a journal," he said. "Belonged to a man named Frank Morrison, engineer who worked Dent's operation before the collapse. He kept records, 8 months of them, documented everything Dent knew and ignored about the support structures in that mine. He paused. Your husband's name is in it. Mae waited. He wasn't just a man who died in a collapse, Rafe said. He was a man who tried to stop it. He signed a complaint, put his name on paper when everyone else told him to keep his head down. His jaw tightened. That's why his name is still in the journal. Morrison made sure of it. The lamp flame moved again. Mae looked at the far wall, at nothing in particular, at the dark space between 2 shelves where the light didn't reach. She'd told herself 100 times in 2 years that Roy was just a man who had been in the wrong place, that it had been bad luck and bad timber, and the specific cruelty of an industry that ground men up and called it accident. She'd built a life on top of that story because it was the only one she had. And now, I need to clean your ribs, she said. I know. She looked at him. I know what you just told me. I heard it. She picked up the cloth again. I'll have the rest of it later. Right now I need you to not die in my storage room. A sound came out of him that might have been the beginning of something. A laugh, maybe. Or something else. He pressed it back down. All right, he said. She worked in silence. He kept himself very still, and she kept herself very focused, and neither of them said anything about Frank Morrison or Roy Harding, or the dark blue scrap of fabric that Rafe Cole set on the grain sack beside him and didn't look at again. Ruth Harmon's footstep on the kitchen floorboard above them. Mae heard it and stopped moving. Both of them stopped breathing. The footstep crossed the kitchen, paused near the stove, then moved back toward the interior of the inn. A door shut somewhere on the 2nd floor. Mae let her breath out slow. She can't know you're here, Rafe said quiet. I know, if Dent's already I know, Mae said again. Ruth has her own arrangements with Boyd Dent. I've known that for a while. She sat back. There, your ribs are bound. It's not a doctor, but it's better than nothing. You need to stay off that side. He looked at her across the small space. You know Ruth Harmon has arrangements with Dent. This is a small town, Mae said, and I clean every room in this building. And you still work here. Where else would I go? She said it without self-pity. Just the arithmetic of her situation, plainly stated. I have a room at the end of the hall and 3 meals a day and wages that cover what they cover. Boyd Dent runs everything within 40 miles. Ruth Harmon runs everything inside this building. 2 years ago I had nowhere to be and she gave me a floor to sleep on. She gathered the medical supplies back into their cloth, but I know what I know. Rafe Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he reached inside his coat and found his belt, worked something loose from it. He held it out to her, a folded sheaf of bills, decent money by the look of it, more than she'd make in a month at the inn. Take that, he said, and don't know anything. Mae looked at the money. Looked at it the way she'd looked at the dark blue fabric, the way she looked at the wall above Roy's side of the bed in the cold months when she couldn't sleep. She thought about what that money would mean, what it would cover, what it would let her stop worrying about, just for a while. Then she looked at Rafe Cole's face and thought about Frank Morrison's journal and Roy's name written in it by a dead man who had wanted to make sure Roy Harding's attempt at doing right got recorded somewhere. I don't want your money, she said. You could use it. Most people could use money, Mae said. That's not the same as needing it enough to take it. She stood up. Get some sleep. The lamp goes out in 10 minutes and you should be quiet as you can manage. I'll bring something in the morning. Mae. His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read in the low light. Something that wasn't quite gratitude, because gratitude would have been easier. And this was something more complicated. Why? She looked at him for a moment. At the cut on his temple and the careful way he held himself and the dark blue scrap of fabric on the grain sack. Because Roy would have, she said, and went back into the kitchen. The front of the inn was quiet when Boyd Dent arrived just past 9 that evening. Mae heard the sound of his wheels from the kitchen, the particular heavy roll of that black-painted coach on the packed dirt of the main street. She knew the sound of it the way she knew the sound of the sign chain and Ruth's footstep on the kitchen floor. Some things you learned without deciding to. She was wiping down the last of the supper tables when she heard Ruth's voice from the small office at the back of the inn's front room, low and private in the way it only got when certain men came to call. Mae moved to the kitchen and stayed there. She picked up a pot that didn't need cleaning and cleaned it. Boyd Dent was 50 years old and wore it with the ease of a man who had always gotten more than he needed. His vest was a dark gray wool, finely made, the kind of thing that cost more than Mae made in a month. Gold watch chain across the front, felt hat sitting perfectly on his head, because he wore it like a hat that understood its position in the world. His boots were leather so good they barely made a sound, which was a detail that bothered Mae in a way she'd never been able to fully articulate. She could hear his voice from the kitchen. Not the words, not at first. Just the tone. The measured ease of a man who had never once had to raise his voice to make a point, because he'd never once had to worry that his point wouldn't land. She moved a little closer to the kitchen door. Not far, just enough. Anyone unusual come through today? His voice conversational, the way you might ask about the weather. Ruth's voice lower, harder to catch. Mae caught. Not that I saw, and then, you'd know if there was anything worth knowing, Mr. Dent. A pause. Then Dent again, something that might have been a sound of satisfaction. I appreciate that, Ruth, I do. Their voices dropped further. Mae went back to the pot. She stood at the kitchen sink, with her hands in water that had gone cold, and thought about the way those two voices had fit together. Easy. Practiced. Not like employer and employee. Like two people with an understanding that predated Mae's arrival at the inn by long enough to have developed its own particular grammar. She had known this in the way she knew a lot of things at Harmon's Inn. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd cleaned Ruth's office. She'd seen the envelopes that came on the first of each month and the receipts that went back with the rider who brought them. She'd never said anything about it because saying something about it would have meant losing the floor under her feet. But she knew what she knew. The front door of the inn opened and closed. The coach wheels rolled south down the main street of Sweetwater Crossing and faded. Ruth Harmon walked into the kitchen a few minutes later and looked at Mae at the sink. Done with the tables? Yes, ma'am. Ruth looked at her for a moment with the particular look she had, the one that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't warm either. The look of a woman who had built something out of necessity and wasn't sentimental about the materials she'd used. Her wool dress was the color of strong tea. Her hair was pulled back and pinned with the precision of someone who had decided a long time ago that certain things would be done correctly or not at all. Bank the stove, Ruth said, and there's a loose hinge on the cold room door that needs wedging before you turn in. The wooden shim is on the top shelf. I'll take care of it, Mae said. Ruth turned to go, stopped. Mae felt the pause on the back of her neck. Anyone come around back tonight? Ruth said. Not quite a question. Not that I saw, Mae said. She heard her own voice come out level and was mildly surprised. Cold enough to keep people inside. Another pause, shorter this time. Good, Ruth said, and went back through to her office. Mae let out a breath she'd been holding since the kitchen door opened. She waited 20 minutes. Then she took a portion of the leftover stew from supper, wrapped in cloth with a hunk of cornbread, and went back to the storage room. Rafe Cole was awake. Of course he was. The kind of man who slept lightly in familiar places probably didn't sleep at all in strange ones. He was sitting upright against the wall with his knees drawn up, and his right hand resting near the empty holster on his hip, which was the kind of instinct that didn't need thinking about. He looked at the food, then at her. Dent was here, Mae said, and set the food beside him. I heard the wheels. He asked Ruth about strangers. She told him nothing worth knowing. Mae sat down on the upturned crate near the door. Which means either she truly didn't see you come in, or she's keeping it close for now. Rafe's jaw moved. What do you think? I think Ruth Harmon is practical, Mae said. She doesn't give anything away she can still use. He ate. Not fast, not slow. Like a man who'd learned to eat when food was available because the next time wasn't guaranteed. Mae watched him and thought about the journal. About 8 months of records kept by a man named Frank Morrison, who was almost certainly dead by now. Because men who wrote down things Boyd Dent didn't want written down didn't tend to make old bones in Wyoming territory. Frank Morrison, she said. Is he still alive? Rafe stopped chewing, just for a moment. No, he said. 3 years ago, they called it a hunting accident. He looked at the far wall. He came to me 6 months before it happened, asked me to keep the journal. Said he didn't trust anyone in town and he didn't trust the mail and he knew I kept to myself up on the mountain. A pause. He said if anything happened to him, I'd know what to do with it, and you waited 3 years. I had something happen to me too. His voice didn't change on the words, flat as the land east of the mountains. I wasn't in the right place to do much of anything for a while. She didn't ask what it was. Not tonight. There was something in the way he said it that told her it was the kind of thing you said all at once or not at all, and he wasn't ready for all at once. The journal, she said. Where is it? Not here. He finished the cornbread. It's safe. You don't need to know more than that right now. You were on your way somewhere with it. Yes, where? He looked at her. Measuring something. There's a territorial circuit judge who comes through Laramie every 6 weeks, he said carefully. A man named Holt who can't be bought. That's not common knowledge. And if you can get the journal to him, then Dent answers for what happened to those men. Mae looked at her hands in her lap. The knuckles were dry and cracked from cold water, the same way they'd been every October for 2 years. She thought about Roy whistling something tuneless in the kitchen on the last morning. She thought about the way the news came, the company man at the door with his hat in his hand, and his face arranged in the manner of someone who had delivered this kind of news before and expected to deliver it again. What do you need? She said. Rafe was quiet for a moment. A day, maybe less. My horse is at the livery, I think. Jenkins' place north of the main street. If I can get her back without making noise, I can be out of here before first light tomorrow. And if Dent's men are watching the livery. He didn't answer that immediately, which was its own kind of answer. You can't ride, Mae said. Not yet, not with those ribs. I've ridden on worse. That's not an argument in your favor. She stood up, smoothed her cotton dress. Sleep. I'll check on the livery in the morning when I go for the milk run. I do it every other day. Nobody looks twice. Mae. You keep saying my name like it's going to change what I've decided. He looked at her. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Whatever the territory south of a smile was before the weather changed it. You don't know me, he said. I know what my husband's name is doing in a dead man's journal, she said. That's enough for tonight. Before she turned the lamp down, she reached back and picked up the scrap of dark blue fabric from the grain sack where Rafe had set it. He didn't say anything. She folded it once and put it in her apron pocket. Then she turned the lamp to its lowest setting and left him to the dark. The morning came in gray and cold, as it had been coming in every morning since September. Mae was up before Ruth, which she made a point of being. The kitchen stove needed building back up, and there were 3 guests in the upstairs rooms who'd want coffee before they had any use for anything else. She moved through the kitchen routine without thinking much about it. Stove, water, coffee. The bread that had to be cut, and the salt pork that had to be sliced, and the eggs that one of the guests had specifically requested the night before, in the slightly demanding tone of a man who expected the world to accommodate him before he was ready to face it. Through all of it, she kept part of her attention on the storage room door. She slipped inside twice, once to leave a cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits on the grain sack before Ruth came down, once to confirm he'd eaten it and was still alive, and his color was better, which it was, though he was pale under his weathering, in the way of a man whose body was arguing hard with something. I'm going to Jenkins' livery, she told him on the second visit. For the milk. I'll see what I can see. He looked like he wanted to argue with this. He was the kind of man who would have argued with it if he'd been on his feet and had any practical alternative. Don't ask about the horse directly, he said instead. I wasn't planning to. And if you see, I've been living in this town for 2 years, Mae said. I know what Dent's men look like. I know which horses belong to which people, and I know which horses I've never seen before. She picked up the empty coffee cup. I'll be back before the guests want second helpings. Jenkins' livery sat at the north end of the main street, a wide, low building that smelled of hay and manure and something not entirely unpleasant about large, warm animals on a cold morning. Old man Jenkins was already out front when Mae came up the street, a man of 60 with a white beard he'd been growing for long enough that it was now a defining feature rather than a choice. Mae bought the milk, stood at the fence with the milk pail at her feet, and talked to Jenkins about the weather, which was what you talked to Jenkins about in October, because the weather was what October was about in Wyoming territory. And Jenkins had opinions on it. She counted the horses in the nearest paddock without appearing to count them. And there, at the far end, a gray mare with good lines and a mountain man's saddle, standing slightly apart from the others the way horses did when they were in an unfamiliar place, and hadn't decided how they felt about it. She also counted 2 men she didn't recognize leaning against the wall of the feed store across the street. Not doing anything particular, just leaning, in the specific way of men who were being paid to be somewhere and were not very interesting about it. Mae talked to Jenkins about snow in the high passes for another 2 minutes, picked up her milk pail, and walked back to the inn at exactly the pace she always walked back from the livery. Inside, she put the milk away and went to the storage room. Gray mare at the north end of Jenkins' paddock, she said. She's there. So are two men across the street who aren't from here. She paused. Your ribs aren't healed enough to ride hard, and if they're watching the livery, riding out on a recognizable horse is the same as putting a sign on yourself. Rafe looked at her from the grain sacks. He had the flat leather pouch from inside his coat open on his knee, and he wasn't looking at the contents but at her. You noticed all that on a milk run? I notice most things, Mae said. I've had to. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the journal isn't here. It's at my cabin. I was carrying something else. A letter from Morrison explaining the journal's contents in case the journal itself was taken. Insurance. He looked at the pouch. They didn't get it, but I can't make it to Judge Holt without the journal itself. Where's your cabin? Half a day's ride north. Up into the foothills. Mae stood with her hands at her sides and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Half a day north. Dent's men watching the livery. Rafe Cole with cracked ribs and no horse she could get to without being seen, and 2 years of being careful and quiet and invisible, suddenly feeling like they'd been accumulating towards something rather than just passing. She thought about Roy. The way his name looked in her mind when she thought of it, not the way he'd looked, not his face or his hands or the sound of his whistling, just his name, solid, present, still here. I know the Osgood Valley route, she said. It runs west of the main trail. Longer by 2 hours, but it doesn't go anywhere near the roads Dent's people use. She looked at Rafe. Roy used to hunt up that way before he took the mine work. He told me about it every season like I was going to want to know the details. She paused. I'm glad I listened. Rafe looked at her for a long time. Mae, this is not your problem. My husband's name is in that journal, she said. That makes it my problem in ways you don't get to decide for me. You'd lose your position here. I already know what Ruth will do if she finds out you spent the night in her storage room. Mae picked up her apron from the nail by the door. That's already in motion whether I do anything else or not. She tied the apron at her back. So the question isn't what I stand to lose. The question is what I do with what's already happening. Rafe Cole looked at her with something in his face that she didn't have a name for immediately. Something that recognized something, like a man who'd spent a long time in his own landscape and had just come across a terrain feature he hadn't expected to find. Then Ruth Harmon's voice from the kitchen. Mae, the gentleman in room 3 wants his eggs. Mae's eyes went to Rafe. She held still. Coming, she called back, her voice perfectly level, and went through the door. She served the eggs. She brought second coffee. She wiped a spill from the floor near the front door and smiled at a man who didn't look at her while she did it and didn't say thank you after. She loaded dishes and washed them and stacked them on the shelf, and did all the things the morning required of her in exactly the order and manner the morning required. And the whole time something was settling in her chest that hadn't been there before. Not quite resolution, not quite courage, something older and quieter than either of those, something that had been building the way water builds behind a thing, before the thing gives way. When the morning rush was done, and Ruth had gone to her office with the ledger, and the upstairs guests had gone about whatever their days held, Mae went back to the storage room one more time. Rafe Cole looked up at her from the grain sacks. Better this morning. His color was steadier. The cut on his temple was closed and clean. He held himself with the careful precision of a man managing pain that was real but manageable, which was a different thing from the night before. Tonight, Mae said, after Ruth closes the office, I know a man who can get us horses without going through the livery. We go north tomorrow before first light. She paused. You can argue with me if you need to, but I'm going with you to get that journal. And we're going by the Osgood route, and you're going to tell me everything Morrison wrote about Shaft 4 on the way. That's what I want. That's the only payment I'm taking. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved against the building. The sign chain rang twice and went quiet. There's something I should tell you first, Rafe Cole said. About why I waited 3 years. Mae sat down on the crate and folded her hands in her lap. Then tell me, she said, and she listened. He told her about Anna on a night that felt like the inside of a held breath. Not all of it, not in order. The way a man tells something he's been carrying alone for long enough that he's forgotten how the pieces fit together. Only that they're heavy and that setting them down even partway costs something. Anna Cole had been 24 years old in the winter of 1877. She'd come west with her family on a wagon train out of Missouri. The kind of crossing that looked like sense in the spring and looked like madness by October. Rafe had been hired to guide the second half of the route, the mountain passage, the part that required someone who knew where the snow came early and where the trail went soft and where you had to make the call to push through versus wait out. He was good at that. He'd been doing it since he was 19 and he'd never lost a party. Until that one. Not all of them. He was careful to say that. Not all of them. 13 made it through. But the wagon that broke an axle at the high crossing, the one that had to be abandoned and its passengers redistributed to other wagons, the one where the decision had to be made fast in failing light with the temperature dropping, and Rafe made the call to keep moving rather than shelter in place. Anna was in that wagon, and Anna's unborn child, and by the time they reached the lower elevation 3 days later, Anna was gone, and the child was gone, and Rafe Cole had 13 survivors who looked at him, the way survivors look at the man who made the last decision before everything changed. The town had agreed with that look. Not out loud, not directly, but Sweetwater Crossing had a way of knowing things, and a way of letting you know it knew them. And so Rafe had gone up the mountain and stayed there, not hiding. Just up the mountain. Mae sat on her crate in the storage room and listened to all of this without interrupting and without moving her hands from her lap. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You made the right call." He looked at her. "You did," she said. "Sheltering in place at elevation in a broken wagon in October in the Rockies with a pregnant woman. That's not a survivable decision either. You made the call that saved 13 people, and one of them happened to be wrong for Anna." She paused. "That's not the same as being wrong." He looked at the far wall. "The town doesn't see it that way. The town doesn't guide mountain crossings." She stood up. "Sleep. We're leaving before first light, and I need to speak to a man about horses." The man about horses was Tom Briggs, Walt's younger brother, who ran a small operation 3 streets off the main road, and who owed Mae a favor from the previous winter, when she'd covered for him with Ruth Harmon, during a period when Tom had been unable to be reliably sober for reasons that had seemed compelling at the time, and looked different in the spring. Tom was not Dent's man. Tom was barely anyone's man, which in the current circumstances was exactly what Mae needed. She went to see him after Ruth's light went out on the second floor, pulled her wool shawl tight against the cold, and walked the back way, through the alley behind the grain merchants, staying off the main street where the 2 strangers might still be keeping their not quite casual watch. Tom was awake. Tom was often awake at odd hours, another legacy of the previous winter. He heard her out in the doorway of his small barn, his breath clouding in the cold, and when she was done, he scratched his beard and said, "Those men by the feed store are Arlo Pence's boys." Mae knew the name. Arlo Pence was Dent's hired man for situations that required a kind of persuasion the company's regular workers weren't suited for. "I need 2 horses," Mae said, "not from the livery, not recognizable, and I need them at the back of the inn property, before 4 in the morning. Tom looked at her for a long time with the look of a man doing arithmetic that involved more than numbers. "This about Dent," he said. "Most things in this valley are about Dent one way or another." Another pause. "Then, my sister-in-law's Roan and the Bay gelding I've been boarding for the Henderson Ranch. Nobody's looking for either of them." He paused again. "Walt know about this." Mae thought of Walt Briggs, Tom's older brother, the former miner. She hadn't spoken to Walt in 3 weeks. But she knew Walt had left Dent's operation before the collapse. Knew it in the way she knew most things, from cleaning rooms and listening to conversations that weren't meant for her. She knew Walt had told at least 2 people at different times that what happened in Shaft 4 wasn't an accident, and had been told both times to be very careful about saying that where the wrong ears could find it. "Not yet," she said, "but I think he might want to be." Tom nodded slowly. 4 in the morning, he said, back of the inn. She was back inside before 11. She banked the kitchen stove for the night, wedged the cold room hinge the way Ruth had asked, and lay down on her narrow bed at the end of the hall, with her cotton dress still on because she wasn't going to sleep, and there was no sense pretending otherwise. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Roy. Not the end of Roy. She'd spent enough time on the end of Roy. She thought about the middle of Roy, the way he argued with himself out loud when he was trying to work something out. The way he'd described the valley route to her in 3 separate hunting seasons like she was going to need the information. The way he'd signed his name to a complaint that every other man in that mine had been too afraid to sign. Roy hadn't been fearless. She knew that. He'd been afraid and done it anyway. which was a different thing and a harder one. And nobody had ever told her that. Nobody had said your husband was afraid and signed his name anyway. They just said accident. Just said sorry. Just said that's how it goes out here. She got up at 3:30, dressed in the dark, packed the small canvas bag she'd prepared after Tom's. Just the essentials. The kind of kit a person put together when they knew they weren't coming back to the same life they were leaving. Rafe was already awake when she opened the storage room door. He had the leather pouch inside his coat and his boots on, and the look of a man who had not slept but had spent the dark hours in the useful way, deciding things. Tom Briggs is bringing horses, Mae said quietly. Back property. 20 minutes. And Ruth, lights and out spent since 10:30. She's a sound sleeper. Mae picked up the canvas bag. We go out the cold room door into the yard, stay along the fence line to the back gate. The fence will block the sight line from the main street. Rafe stood, careful. The ribs were still costing him, but the cost was manageable now. He moved like a man working with his limitations rather than against them, which Mae respected. She had been doing the same thing for 2 years. They went through the cold room door into the night. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since she'd visited Tom. The stars were out in force, the sky the particular black of high altitude and no moon. And Mae navigated the fence line by memory and by the specific knowledge of a woman who had taken this same path in the dark many times for many reasons over 2 years. The yard, the fence, the gate latch that had to be lifted and turned at the same time because it had been wrong since September, and she'd mentioned it to Ruth twice without result. Tom was there with the horses, the roan mare and the bay gelding, both saddled, both calm in the way of animals who had been worked enough to take nighttime departures in stride. Tom handed over the reins without ceremony, and Mae put her bag behind the saddle of the roan without looking at him. Walt Briggs, she said, tell him Frank Morrison's journal is real and it's coming out. Tell him if he's willing to speak, there'll be a place for his words to go. Tom's jaw moved once. Where? Tell him Sweetwater Crossing. 3 days. She paused. He'll understand or he won't. She mounted. Beside her, Rafe got onto the bay gelding with the economy of movement of a man who rode the way some men breathed. Automatically and without thought, even when everything else was difficult. He looked at Tom. Tom looked back at him with the careful look of a man filing something away for later consideration. Then they rode north, into the dark, staying off the main road, cutting west along the drainage ditch behind the Fletcher property, and picking up the Osgood Valley route where it began past the old mill, which was a collapsed structure now that had been an ambition once, and was now just a landmark. Mae led. Because she knew this route and Rafe didn't, not the way she knew it, and because leading felt right in the specific way that things feel right when they are simply accurate to the situation, regardless of what you expected the situation to be. The valley route took them west before turning north, adding distance, but trading the open road for terrain that folded itself into draws and tree lines that swallowed 2 riders and made them nothing. The foothills came up on their right as the sky began its slow negotiation from black to gray, and Mae could feel the temperature in the air change the way it changed at elevation, thinner and cleaner and honest in the way that cold, honest things were honest. They didn't talk much in the first hours. There was nothing wrong with that. Mae had spent enough time around people who talked to fill space to appreciate a man who let space be what it was. Around the second hour, moving through a stretch of ponderosa pine that smelled of pitch and cold earth, Rafe said, Roy told you about this route season by season. 3 years of hunting seasons, Mae said. He was very thorough. And you remembered all of it. I paid attention. She guided the roan around a deadfall without slowing. Roy used to say I remembered everything except things as I decided weren't worth keeping. A pause. He was right about that. Rafe was quiet for a moment. Then he sounds like a man worth knowing. He was. She said it without the weight she used to carry on those words. Not lighter, exactly. Just differently distributed. The way a load shifts when you've been carrying it long enough to find the balance. He would have liked this, not the reason for it, but the riding north before dawn with something that needed doing. He was that kind of man. The ponderosa thinned out as the trail climbed, giving way to open slopes scattered with sage and occasional rock outcropping. The sky was moving from gray to the particular pale color that came just before the actual dawn. Mae could see the shape of the terrain now, the way the foothills stacked up against each other, and the first real peaks showed themselves above the tree line to the north. Rafe's cabin sat in a fold of the mountain that you wouldn't find if you didn't know it was there. The approach came through a stand of aspen that had gone gold, and were in the process of letting go, leaves coming down in the light wind, like something being slowly released. The cabin itself was low and solid, built from the landscape rather than imposed on it. The logs fitted close the way a man fits things when he has time and no reason to cut corners. The door was locked with a bar mechanism from the inside, which meant the window. Mae waited at the horses while Rafe went to the east window, removed something from the frame that she couldn't see from where she stood, and had the door open in under a minute. A man who knew his own building's specific logic. Inside was one room, efficient, a working space rather than a living space, though it served as both. A stove that needed building up, a table with maps weighted at the corners by stones that looked deliberately chosen for their flatness, shelving made from split logs and wooden pegs. And in the far corner, behind a false section of the back wall that Rafe reached for without ceremony, a space between the outer log and an interior board, just wide enough to hold a flat tin box. The journal was inside the tin. A medium-sized ledger with a dark cover, the kind of book a company man would keep records in, which was of course exactly what Frank Morrison had been. Mae held it while Rafe built the stove back up, and the weight of it was different from what she'd expected. Not heavier, just more present. The specific presence of a thing that had been kept carefully for a long time by someone who understood its value. She opened it to the middle. The handwriting was small and precise. The handwriting of a man trained to record accurately rather than expressively. Columns of dates, notes on timber grades and load calculations, reports filed and the responses received or not received, and periodically in the margin of certain pages a different kind of notation, names, initials. Specific conversations remembered in specific detail. She found Roy's name on the 43rd page. She found it the way you find something you've been looking for, in the way that means you've been looking for a long time, without admitting it to yourself. There. His name in someone else's handwriting. R. Harding, signed complaint re. Crossbeam grade. Form submitted 14 Feb 1000. 880. Received by Dent office. No response logged. And below that, in smaller letters, as if Morrison had written it quickly and hadn't gone back to expand it, Harding told me he knew what this meant. Said he was signing anyway. He knew what it meant. Roy had known that signing his name to a complaint in Boyd Dent's territory in 1880 was not a safe thing to do. He had known and he had done it, and he had told Frank Morrison he was doing it with full knowledge. And Mae had spent 2 years thinking of him as a man who had simply been in the wrong place, and now she understood he had chosen to be in the place where he was. She was not going to cry in a man's cabin at 5 in the morning. That was not available to her right now. She had a full understanding of what was and was not available to her right now, and crying was on the other side of the line. She closed the journal, held it in both hands for a moment. Then she said, with her back still to Rafe and her voice completely level, he knew what signing meant. Morrison wrote it down. Rafe didn't say anything for a moment. She heard the stove door close and the sound of the fire catching. Then I know, you've read the whole thing 3 times and you waited. She turned around, not angry. She needed him to understand she wasn't angry, because anger would be the wrong thing here, and she needed to be precise. You waited 3 years with this. His face didn't change the way a guilty man's face changed. It changed in a different way. The way a man's face changed when he was confronted with something he'd already confronted himself about more thoroughly than anyone else could manage. Yes, he said. I did Anna. Anna. And what came after Anna? He stood at the stove with his hands at his sides. I was not a functional man for a year after that crossing, and then I was a functional man who had decided that what Morrison had given me was too dangerous to move on. Until I was certain. I needed to be certain about the judge. Certain about the route. Certain I wasn't going to walk into something that ended with the journal in Dent's hands and Morrison's name on nothing. He paused. I was almost certain enough 3 months ago. And then someone told Dent I was moving. Who? I don't know yet. Mae looked at him across the room. At the man who had made a wrong right decision on a mountain and been paying for it in the currency of other people's judgment ever since. At the man who had held Frank Morrison's journal for 3 years and hadn't lost it or sold it or burned it because burning it would have been easier and he hadn't done the easier thing. All right, she said. We need to be moving. If Dent's men find the cabin empty, they'll look for a direction. She was pulling on her shawl when the sound came, hooves, below the tree line, moving with the purpose of people who knew roughly where they were going, which meant they'd been to this cabin before, or had been told how to find it. 2 horses, maybe 3, coming up through the aspen. Mae looked at Rafe. He was already at the door. Side of the mountain goes up from the north window, he said. There's a game trail that cuts east along the ridge, comes out above the valley. Our horses have to leave them. He said it flat, the way you said things that were going to happen regardless of how you felt about them. They'll find them. It buys us time. How much? Enough. He opened the north. Cold air, the smell of aspen and cold stone. Go, Mae went, because she was not a woman who argued with the need to move when the need to move was clear. She went through the window with the journal inside her coat, against her ribs, and landed on the slope outside in the dry grass, and Rafe came through behind her, with the efficiency of a man who had left places in a hurry before, and had refined the technique. The game trail was where he said it was. They went up it fast and quiet, Mae's leather boots finding purchase on the rocky grade, the way Roy's descriptions of this terrain had prepared her for, without her knowing that was what was happening. 3rd season he'd hunted up here, he'd described this exact ridge to her. Said the footing was deceptive on the east side, looked loose but held. She'd filed it away without knowing why. Below them she heard the cabin door. Voices. 2 men close enough to confirm Rafe's count. They didn't stop moving. The ridge trail bent east and then down, dropping into a draw that ran parallel to a dry creek bed, and Mae recognized this too from Roy's season-by-season accounting of a landscape he'd loved. And she was only now seeing for the first time and thinking, he was right. It was exactly like he said. An hour of hard moving brought them to the lower elevation, where the aspen gave way to open meadow and the geometry of the land changed. And there, at the tree line's edge where the meadow began, a man on a gray horse sat waiting with a patient someone who had chosen his spot carefully and was prepared to be in it for a while. Walt Briggs was nothing like his brother Tom, in the way of physical resemblance, but exactly like him in the particular stillness that descended on both of them when they had decided something. He was 60 years old with a white beard and the hands of a man who had spent decades doing work that cost them. He wore a flannel shirt under a leather work vest, his cloth hat pulled down against the morning cold. He had a rifle across his saddle and he was not pointing it at them, which felt like a complete thought. Mae pulled up at the tree line. How did you know where to come out? Walt looked at her with the considering look of an older man evaluating a situation that has moved faster than expected. Tom told me you knew the Osgood route, he said. I've hunted this valley since before either of you was born. There's only one way off that ridge on the east side that doesn't take you back toward Dent's people. He looked at Rafe. And I've known where Cole's cabin was for 10 years. Figured the math on where you'd come out. Rafe looked at him from the bay. Walt, I know what you've got, Walt said. Tom told me enough, and I was in that mine, Cole. I know what Morrison knew, because I knew it too, and I couldn't prove it, and I've been living with that for 2 years. His jaw moved. I can testify. If there's somewhere for it to go. Mae thought of the circuit judge, Laramie, the timeline that required them to move now and move right. There is, she said, but we need to get there before Dent's people understand what's in motion. Walt looked at her for a moment with the look of a man recalibrating his understanding of the situation in front of him. Then he looked at Rafe. Whose idea was the Osgood route? Rafe didn't hesitate. Hers. Walt nodded once, the nod of a man who has made a decision and is done making it. My pack horse is back in the trees, he said. I brought enough for 3 days. The eastern pass to Laramie avoids Dent's territory if we go by Ridgeline Creek. He paused. I know that route too. They had to stop by midday because Rafe's ribs had reached their limit for the morning's pace, and his color had gone the gray of a man whose body was telling him that pushing further would cost more than the time saved. Walt found a sheltered spot in a rock formation that blocked the wind from 3 directions, and Mae built a fire small enough to be invisible past 20 feet. The 3 of them sat in the midday cold, and Mae read sections of the journal aloud. Not all of it. The relevant sections. The ones that documented Dent's knowledge. His specific instructions to the foreman regarding the crossbeam substitution. The cost savings recorded and attributed. The reports received and set aside. Walt listened without expression. When she reached the section documenting the complaint signatures, including Roy's name, Walt said, There were 12 men who knew about the crossbeams. 8 of them died in the collapse. 2 of the others took money to be quiet and left the territory. That leaves me. He looked at his hands. I left before the collapse, told myself I'd done what I could by leaving, which was a story I told myself well enough to live with. A pause. Not anymore. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the rocks above them a bird moved and then stopped. Mae folded the journal back against her coat and said, Morrison wrote that Roy told him he knew what signing meant. Walt looked at her. Roy Harding was the most stubborn man I ever worked next to, he said. Not in a stupid way. In the way of a man who'd decided what he was and wasn't going to be talked out of it. He paused. I told him not to sign. He told me that was my choice and signing was his. Another pause. I've thought about that conversation a considerable number of times in the last 2 years. The fire, the wind in the rocks above them, the distant sound of a hawk or something like it. Rafe said, how far behind us do you think they are? Walt considered this. They found the cabin empty. They found the horses. They'll figure the Osgood route eventually. But Pence's boys aren't mountain men. They know roads. He paused. We've got a day. Maybe less if Dent sends someone faster. Mae looked at the journal in her hands, thought about the weight of it. The specific weight of 8 months of careful records kept by a man who knew keeping them was dangerous and kept them anyway. The same way Roy had signed his name to a piece of paper knowing what it meant. The thing she'd been feeling since the storage room, the thing she'd thought of as something settling, was clearer now. It wasn't resolution. It was closer to recognition. The recognition of a woman who had been handed a shape she hadn't understood and was finally seeing what it was. She stood up and knocked the fire down carefully until it was ash and ember and nothing that could be seen. We should keep moving, she said, and the path to Laramie, to Judge Holt, to the place where Frank Morrison's careful handwriting would finally reach the ears it had always been meant for, was still half a territory away. But it was in front of them. And for the first time since Roy's name had come to her, not as a wound but as a direction, Mae Harding understood that this was exactly where she was supposed to be, not because anyone had put her here. Because she had walked herself here step by step, decision by decision, bucket by bucket over 2 years of days that had been building toward this without asking her permission. The afternoon stretched out ahead of them, cold and open and real. She picked up the roan's reins and looked north, toward the pass, toward Laramie, toward whatever Judge Holt was going to make of a dead engineer's journal, and a former miner's testimony and a widow's insistence that 8 names be said out loud in a place where saying them meant something. Rafe came up beside her on the bay. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. But the fact of him there, on her right, moving in the same direction at the same pace for the same reason, was a thing she registered in the way you registered things that were new to your landscape, not with sentiment, with the plain accuracy of a woman who noticed most things. They rode. Laramie sat at the end of a long ride and felt nothing like relief. Bigger than Sweetwater Crossing, in every dimension that mattered: more noise, more horses, more people moving with purposes that had nothing to do with each other. The main street ran wide and the buildings along it had the permanence of things that expected to outlast whoever built them. Mae noticed all of it and filed none of it. She had one reason for being here, and the reason was in the flat tin box inside Rafe's coat. They came in from the eastern approach at mid-morning. 3 riders who looked like nothing worth stopping for. Walt knew a woman on the edge of town who asked no questions about her borders, a professional courtesy she had extended for long enough that had become a kind of institution. The horses went into her small stable. The 3 of them went into a back room with 2 cots, and a window facing the alley and a door that locked from inside. Mae sat on the edge of a cot and felt the last 36 hours settle onto her all at once. Not weakness, just the body presenting its accounting after a long expenditure. She didn't lie down. Lying down meant stopping, and stopping meant living inside the gap between now and whatever came next. And that gap was not somewhere she wanted to be without something to do in it. Rafe sat at the small table near the window. His ribs had been managed through the ride by will and positioning and not much else, and the managing showed now in the gray around his mouth. Walt had gone to find Archer, the courthouse clerk he'd spoken with before, about the shape of what they were carrying. You should eat something, Mae said. So should you. I will when Walt gets back. He looked at her across the table. You're not afraid this doesn't work? I'm afraid it doesn't work, she said. I'm just not going to let that be the thing that decides what I do today. She looked at the tin box between them. Morrison kept that journal for 8 months, knowing what keeping it meant. The least I can do is walk it into a courthouse. Walt came back in 20 minutes with food and information in that order, setting a paper-wrapped portion of cornbread and salt pork on the table before he said anything else. Judge Holt was in Laramie. His clerk Archer had confirmed that Holt would receive documented evidence of a capital crime if the documentation was what Walt had described it as being. Archer's own brother-in-law had worked the valley near Shaft 4 and had not survived it. Some information, Walt observed, found its own audience. They ate. Then they went to see Judge Holt. The courthouse was brick and deliberate, the kind of federal construction that wanted you to understand it intended to be here after you were gone. Inside it smelled of lamp oil and old paper, and the dust of decisions that had outlasted the people who made them. A clerk at the front desk assessed the three of them with the practiced look of a man whose job required distinguishing between people with legitimate business and people who merely believed if they had it. Walt spoke to him quietly. The clerk went somewhere. They waited on a bench in the hall with the journal in Mae's lap and the muffled sound of voices from closed rooms on either side. Archer came out himself. 40s, careful eyes, the kind of face that had processed enough difficult information to stop being surprised by it without going all the way to indifferent. He looked at the journal, looked at Mae's hands around it, then at Walt. The judge will see all three of you, he said. Judge Holt was a lean man of 60 with the complete stillness of someone who had learned that unnecessary motion was a form of imprecision. His desk held papers arranged in the systems of a man who processed large volumes of information and had refined those systems over years. He looked at them over the desk with the attention of someone who reads situations the way other men read text, quickly and with retention. Walt gave him the shape of it in plain language. No embellishment, no appeal to emotion. Just the sequence of events and the documentation that supported them, stated in the order that made the logic clearest. Mae watched Holt's face as Walt spoke and saw his attention locate itself on the relevant facts and stay there. When Walt finished, Holt said one word, journal. Mae put it on his desk. He read for a long time. Not casually. The way you read something when you understand that how you read it is going to determine everything you do with it afterward. He turned pages slowly and sometimes went back, and Mae noticed he paid particular attention to the marginal notations, Morrison's records of specific conversations, specific instructions, specific decisions made by a man who had written them down and then died in circumstances that suited Boyd Dent's interests. When he reached the page with Roy's name, he didn't look up. He read the notation. He turned the page. When he closed the journal, he set it in the center of his desk and looked at the three of them without speaking for a moment that held its own weight. Mr. Briggs, he said, your testimony establishes that you observed the substitution of substandard timber in the support structure of Shaft 4 and that you reported this concern informally before leaving Dent's employ. Yes, sir. Morrison's documentation is thorough. His handwriting can be authenticated against company records filed with the territory. Holt looked at Rafe. You've considered this. For 3 years, Rafe said. I've had time to work out what would be needed. Holt looked at Mae. Mrs. Harding. You witnessed a conversation between Dent and Ruth Harmon at the inn that established a prior arrangement between them. Yes, sir. And there is a contract. Mae set the piece of dark blue fabric on the desk beside the journal. She had carried it inside her coat since the storage room. This was in Mr. Cole's hand when I found him. It's from a Dent Company vest. It connects the man who attacked him to Dent's operation directly. She paused, and Ruth Harmon has a contract in her possession, signed by a Colorado company acting for Dent, dated 1 week before Mr. Cole was attacked on the road for the acquisition of Mr. Cole's land. The contract establishes that the attack was not random. It was preparation. Holt looked at the scrap of fabric. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. The recognition of a detail that clarified the geometry of everything else. Mrs. Harmon will need to produce that contract voluntarily or by order. I believe she'll produce it voluntarily, Mae said. When she understands that the shape of this has changed. You're certain of that? Mae looked at him steadily. Ruth Harmon has made calculations about Boyd Dent before. I'm asking her to make a different one. She's practical enough to understand when the arithmetic has changed. Holt picked up his pen. I'll send a deputy to Sweetwater Crossing today, he began writing. Mr. Briggs, formal deposition within the hour. Mr. Cole, the journal remains with me for authentication. Mrs. Harding, your witness statement will be taken by my clerk. He kept writing without looking up. I want to be clear about what this means. A formal proceeding will take time. Dent has resources and he will use them. What this journal does, if authentication holds, is make it impossible for Boyd Dent to continue in this territory as though 8 men did not die because of decisions he made and wrote down. They were in that building for 3 hours. Walt gave his deposition to Archer. Mae and Rafe gave their statements to a different clerk who wrote everything down with the careful hand of a man who understood that what he was recording would outlast all of them. When the clerk read Mae's statement back, she corrected 2 errors of phrasing and confirmed the rest. In the hallway afterward, Walt stood with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who had carried something heavy for 2 years and had just set it down in the right place, and wasn't quite sure yet what his hands were for. Done, Mae said. Done, Walt said. Outside, Laramie moved around them with the indifference of a town that contained important events regularly and had stopped marking them individually. Mae stood on the courthouse steps with the cold air coming off the mountains and thought about Roy's name in Morrison's handwriting. Thought about what it meant that a dead engineer had been more careful about recording Roy's courage than anyone living had been about honoring it. We go back, she said. Rafe stood beside her. Dent will know before we arrive. Then we arrive knowing what we know, Mae said. Which is more than we had 3 days ago. She looked at him. Sweetwater Crossing has been his territory for long enough. It's mine too. It's time that was true out loud. They rode back by the Eastern Pass because right routes stayed right, regardless of how many times you used them. Walt rode with them, without being asked and without explaining himself, which was the kind of person Walt had turned out to be under everything else. A man who stayed with things to their end once he'd decided they were worth staying with. They reached Sweetwater Crossing in the late afternoon of the following day, came in from the south, which gave them the approach that kept them off the main street the longest. The first thing Mae did was go to Ruth Harmon, because it needed to be the first thing. And Mae had learned over 2 years of hard mornings that the first thing never waited to be more convenient. Ruth was in her office with the day's delivery receipts, dark wool dress against the late light from the window behind her. She looked up when Mae came in. Her face did the thing it did when it was deciding how to arrange itself, that moment of internal calculation before the expression landed on its response. Mae closed the door behind her, sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited. Ruth watched this without comment. Mae put Morrison's journal on the desk between them, then the scrap of dark blue Dent Company fabric beside it. Then she said, Ruth, I found Rafe Cole in your back property 4 nights ago with this in his hand. You need to decide what that means to you. Ruth looked at the fabric. She recognized the color. Mae watched her recognize it. I need the contract, Mae said. The one from the Colorado Company. The one Dent left here for you to keep. Ruth was quiet for a moment that had edges to it. Then she said, if I give that to the deputy, Boyd Dent's operation is under formal inquiry by a territorial circuit judge in Laramie. Mae said. Frank Morrison's journal is in Judge Holt's hands right now, being authenticated against company records. Walt Briggs has given his deposition. What Boyd Dent does or doesn't do is going to matter considerably less in 30 days than it matters at this moment. She didn't look away from Ruth's face. You have a choice to make. You've made choices about Boyd Dent before. I'm not here to judge the ones that are already made. I'm here about this one. Ruth looked at the journal, at the scrap of fabric, at Mae's hands folded on the desk, the knuckles still cracked from 2 years of cold water, unchanged. Ruth Harmon had built this in from nothing using the materials available to her, and she had never been sentimental about what those materials were. But sentiment and arithmetic were different things, and Ruth Harmon's arithmetic had always been precise. She opened the middle drawer of her desk, took out the envelope, set it on top of the journal without speaking. Mae opened it. The contract was what she'd expected: a Colorado Company name, Dent's signature by proxy, the legal description of Rafe's land, dated 7 days before the attack on the road. Everything needed to establish that the attack was not opportunistic. It was scheduled. She put the contract back in the envelope. Looked at Ruth. The deputy from Laramie arrives tomorrow. I'll be here, Ruth said. She picked up her pen, put it back down, then said, without looking up, In a voice that was smaller than her usual one but not weak, "Roy Harding came in here once, before the collapse. He asked if I knew anything about the conditions in that mine." A pause. I told him I wasn't in the business of knowing things like that. Another pause. "I've thought about that conversation." Mae sat with that for a moment. "He would have understood," she said finally. "He knew how people survived out here. That's generous of you." "It's accurate," Mae said and stood up. Sheriff Amos Webb had sent word to Boyd Dent by the following morning. Not a summons, a request for a conversation. The distinction mattered to Dent, and Webb knew it mattered and used the distinction deliberately. Because a man like Webb, who had worked in Dent's shadow for years, had learned which levers moved which parts of Boyd Dent's sense of himself. Dent arrived mid-morning in his black coach, vest, watch chain, felt hat, the whole architecture of a man who had always defined the terms of every situation he entered. He stepped down from the coach and saw Webb on the porch of the inn, and the other people on the porch behind Webb, and made an immediate calculation about the shape of the morning. His expression arranged itself into the controlled attention of a man absorbing new information and already working out his response before the information was finished arriving. Mae came down the steps. She had on a clean blue cotton dress and her wool shawl against the cold, and she walked across the packed dirt of the main street with the stride of a woman who had made a decision about what she was going to do with this morning and had made it all the way, without reservation, without the part of herself that spent 2 years apologizing for existing in spaces that belonged to other people. She stopped where she could be heard by everyone on that street. Not performing, reporting. "My name is Mae Harding," she said. "My husband was Roy Harding. He worked shaft 4 of your mine, and he signed a written complaint about the crossbeam supports in February of 1880. He signed it knowing what signing meant. That complaint was received by your office and produced no response. 8 weeks later the shaft collapsed." She said the names, all 8 of them. She had memorized them from Morrison's journal on the second night of writing. In the cold with the fire low, she said them in order, and with the same weight for each one, and the weight was real because these were real men who had worked real hours in real darkness under structures that a real man had decided were not worth the cost of making sound. The street was listening. Not a crowd that had gathered for a spectacle. People who had paused mid-errand because something in the morning had changed quality and required attention. Some of these men had known the names she was saying. Some of these women had sat with the wives those names had left behind. Boyd Dent let her finish. That was a calculation too. Interrupting a widow saying the names of dead men in front of a town was a different kind of problem than whatever problem he was already managing. His face stayed in its controlled arrangement. His hands stayed at his sides. When she finished the 8th name, Mae reached into her coat and held up the scrap of dark blue fabric. Held it so the street could see it. "This was in Rafe Cole's hand when I found him injured behind this building 4 nights ago. It's from a Dent Company vest. The man who wore it attacked Mr. Cole on the road north of town." She paused. 1 week before that attack, a contract was signed for the acquisition of Mr. Cole's land that sits above the richest unmapped gold deposit in this part of Wyoming territory. That contract has Boyd Dent's authorization on it. It's in the hands of the deputy from Laramie right now. Dent stepped forward. 1 step, controlled. "What you're describing," he said. His voice pitched for the street with the ease of a man who had used rooms and streets, and the air itself as instruments for decades, is a series of accusations from a woman who has spent 2 years as a hired hand in a boarding house. No position, no property, no standing before any court in this territory. He let that sit for a moment. "Understand, grief does things to people. I understand a widow looks for explanations, but grief and evidence are different categories, and no one in this territory has confused them yet." The street was quiet. Mae did not move, did not raise her voice, because raising your voice was what you did when you weren't certain, and she was finished with uncertainty about this. "Mr. Cole has standing," she said. "Mr. Briggs has standing and has given his formal deposition in Laramie. Frank Morrison had standing and exercised it for 8 months in a journal that is currently being authenticated by a territorial circuit judge." She looked at Dent directly. "You're right that I have no property. I had a husband who did the right thing and died for it and spent 2 years being called an accident. I'm correcting that today, in front of these people, because these are his people too and they deserve to know." She stepped back. Walt Briggs walked out from the group near the feed store. He had his cloth hat in his hands, and he looked at Boyd Dent with the look of a man who had been deciding something for 2 years and had finished deciding it. He didn't speak. He walked across the street and stood on Mae's left side and was still. Rafe came down the porch steps and stood on her right, not in front of her, not between her and Dent, just there, beside her, in the specific way that made a statement without requiring language, the way that a man who had learned economy with words had learned economy with everything else too. And then Ruth Harmon opened the inn door. She came down the steps in her dark wool dress with the contract envelope in her hand. And she walked to where Sheriff Webb stood, and she held it out to him, there, in the middle of the street, in front of everyone, without ceremony and without apology, the way you did something that was overdue. Webb took it. Boyd Dent looked at the four of them, looked at Webb with the envelope, looked at the street around him, and what the street was doing, which was standing still and watching with the particular attention of people who had made their own calculations about what they were seeing and where it pointed. He had walked into situations he controlled for so long that the muscles of him still expected to find the shape he expected, the lever that would shift the room, the face that would follow his lead because it always had, the silence that would fill in the direction he aimed it. None of those things were here. His lawyer leaned toward him and said something brief and quiet. Dent listened. His jaw moved once. Then he looked at Mae with the look of a man who was filing something away, not conceding, not admitting, but registering that the landscape had changed in ways that required new navigation. "I will address any formal inquiry through the appropriate channels," he said, controlled to the end. The voice of a man who had not yet accepted what the morning had done but understood that saying more would only accelerate it. He walked back to his coach, got in. The coach moved south down the main street of Sweetwater Crossing, wheels loud in the quiet, and turned at the crossroads and was gone. Nobody cheered, because this was not that kind of town, and this was not that kind of morning. But the man outside the feed store who had stood still through every name, Mae said, looked at her. When she turned back toward the inn and nodded once, deliberate, the way you acknowledged something that didn't need words added to it. And the woman in front of the dry goods met Mae's eyes for a moment, with an expression that said everything it needed to say in the half-second before she looked away. Enough, more than enough, the kind of enough that accumulated differently than the other kind. The deputy from Laramie had the contract. He had Walt's written testimony. He had the scrap of dark blue fabric that Mae surrendered to him that afternoon, properly witnessed, entered into the formal record of the inquiry that Judge Holt had already set in motion. Boyd Dent's mining operation was suspended pending investigation before the end of that week. His men left. Arlo Pence's boys, the ones who had watched the livery, were gone before the weekend. The property sat quiet for the first time in years, and the quiet had a different character than the valley's ordinary silence. Heavier, more honest. The formal proceedings moved at the pace that territorial law moved in 1882, which was deliberate and resistant to urgency. Dent's legal representation was expensive and persistent and filed objections at every opportunity available to it. None of this was a surprise. Mae had never expected swift. She had expected true, and true was what was moving through the Laramie courthouse at whatever pace it moved. She went back to work at the inn not because she had to, because she had decided, in the specific way she decided things, that being useful in the time between now and the next thing was better than waiting in the space between. Ruth had adjusted the pay rate before Mae returned. She had also stopped the small daily reminders of the conditional nature of Mae's position, the half-sentences and significant pauses that had been Ruth's way of maintaining a particular structure between them. Mae noticed the absence of those things the way you noticed when a sound that had been present for so long you'd stopped hearing it was finally gone. Rafe came down from the mountain twice in those weeks. The first time was to give his formal statement to the deputy, which required 2 hours, and produced a document thick enough that the deputy needed a new ledger page. He arrived in the morning and left in the late afternoon, stopping in the inn's kitchen long enough to drink 1 cup of coffee without being asked. The second time he came with no reason, he stated. He helped Tom Briggs repair a fence section that had been failing since spring, and that Tom had been mentioning to people, without getting around to addressing. He ate supper at the inn's common table. He sat in the kitchen after, at the small table near the window, while Mae worked on the accounts that Ruth had recently extended to her. She put down her pen at some point and said, "The land on the northern approach, the flat section below where your cabin sits." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "There's a route through there that would give wagon trains a cleaner pass than the one they're using now. Lower elevation. Better footing in the early season when the higher routes are still questionable." "A station," Mae said. "Water from the eastern spring. Enough flat ground for a proper structure. Feed storage." He paused, the pause of a man choosing words not from lack of them but from wanting the right ones. "I've been thinking about it since summer. What it would need. Someone who knew how to manage what got built." "Someone who knew how to manage what got built," he agreed. He looked at her across the small table, not the evaluating look from the storage room, not the measuring look from the mountain. Something else. The look of a man who had spent 5 years reducing his world to the size of one person and had recently, carefully, without announcement, begun to expand it. "I'm not asking you to work for me," he said. "I'm asking if you want to build something." Mae looked at the ledger in front of her, at the accounts she had balanced because she balanced things carefully and without illusion, and had been doing it for 2 years in service of someone else's building. She thought about Roy. Not the shape of grief. The shape of Roy himself, the specific stubbornness of him. The way he had looked at a situation and decided what kind of man he was going to be inside it and had not been talked out of it. She thought he would have found the arithmetic of this moment funny and right and exactly like something that happened to people who stayed honest long enough. "Yes," she said, simply. The way she said things that were already decided. Rafe was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and took his wide-brimmed hat from the hook by the door. "I'll start on the foundation before the ground freezes," he said. "I'll be up in March to see what needs doing from the management side." He nodded once, and went out into the dark. She sat at the table after he left and listened to the inn settle around her. The creak of the old building in the wind, the distant sound of the sign chain. 2 years of this building's sounds, and she knew them all, and none of them were hers, and she was done with that in a way that had no bitterness in it. The bitterness had been deposited in the Laramie courthouse with everything else. The way station took shape through the winter. Rafe built the main structure with 2 men from the valley who needed work in the slow season. Walt Briggs came up twice and turned out to have a gift for stone foundation work that nobody, including Walt, had previously known about. He noted this without surprise or pleasure, in the way of a man who had added a fact to an internal ledger. May came up in March, when the snow had pulled back enough to show the shape of what had been built. Rafe walked her through it, the main room, the horse structure, the spring on the eastern edge, explaining things once, without repeating himself, and watching her absorb the information with the completeness he had come to expect from her. On the walk back across the northern meadow, in the cold, clear air with the peaks still carrying their winter load above them, May said, "Morrison wrote something in the margin of the journal's last page, after the final dated entry. I didn't read it aloud on the mountain." She looked at the trail ahead of them. It said, "I hope whoever reads this knows they are reading the work of a man who believed it mattered. I believe it still." Rafe walked beside her. The aspen along the meadow's edge were bare, their branches making the sound of something patient. He knew what was coming, May said. When he wrote that, I think he'd already understood what Morrison knew about that kind of man, that Dent had already made the same calculation twice, and would make it again. And Morrison wrote it anyway. She paused. Roy was the same. He knew what signing meant, and he signed. That's not a small thing. I spent 2 years calling it bad luck, because bad luck was easier to live with than the truth, which is that the people who do the right thing in places where the right thing is dangerous don't usually get credit for it until someone refuses to let the record stand the way it was. Rafe stopped walking. She stopped a step later and turned to look at him. He said Anna argued with horses. May waited, not at them, with them. She had a position she'd stated. She expected a response. She generally felt she won. He looked at the mountains above the tree line. She would have liked you, not because you're alike, because she had no patience for people who couldn't make up their minds about who they were. She said it was the only kind of dishonesty that was truly exhausting. He paused. She would have had you made up in about 10 minutes. May looked at him. What did she decide about you? Something crossed his face that had no name she could put on it immediately. That I was the only person she'd ever met who was more stubborn than she was, he said. She considered it a significant compliment. Mae laughed. The real kind. The kind that arrived without permission and cost something, and was worth it. It went out into the cold, clear air of the northern meadow, and up toward the bare aspen, and Rafe Cole stood in the March light of 1,800 and with kindness? 883, the expression of a man hearing something returned to a place where it had been absent long enough that he'd stopped expecting it back. The first wagon train came through in late April. A family out of Kansas heading northwest, a broken wheel rim, a father running on the last miles of his confidence. Mae had the wheel fixed, the family fed, and the father's map corrected before the end of the first day. When the train pulled out on the second morning, the father shook her hand with both of his, the grip of a man expressing something that the available vocabulary didn't quite cover. She filed that away. In the same place she kept Roy's voice describing the Osgood Valley route in 3 separate hunting seasons. The same place she kept Morrison's last line. The same place she kept the weight of Rafe's shoulder against hers in the March wind, the way he had begun simply being in whatever space she occupied without requiring explanation for it, the way that had quietly, over months, become the shape of her days. In September, with the aspens going gold, and the air sharpening toward the cold that would arrive without asking, a letter came from Ruth Harmon. Ruth's handwriting, controlled and precise, the script of a woman who did not waste ink. Mae read it standing outside the station door in the morning light. The letter covered practical matters first. The niece's girl was working out. The laundry situation had improved. The cold room hinge had finally been properly repaired by someone who apparently knew what they were doing, which Ruth noted as an improvement on previous management without elaborating. Then, at the bottom, in smaller letters that showed signs of having been written and reconsidered and written again, I spoke with Walt Briggs last week. He told me what you said to him at the courthouse in Laramie. That Sweetwater crossing was your territory too. I have been thinking about that since he told me. I believe you were right. I believed it before you left, but I am not practiced at saying things like that. And so I am saying it now in a letter where I don't have to watch anyone's face while I say it. Roy Harding would have been proud of you. Not surprised, just proud. I should have told you that 2 years ago. Mae folded the letter, held it for a moment, then she put it in her coat pocket, next to the place where Morrison's fabric scrap had rested all the way from Sweetwater Crossing to Laramie and back. Rafe came around the side of the station with a coil of rope over one shoulder, saw her face, and stopped. He didn't ask. He had learned over months of mornings and evenings and one long winter of building something in the cold, when asking was the right tool and when it wasn't. Mae said, Ruth sent a letter. He waited. She said Roy would have been proud. Mae looked at the eastern road, at the long open approach that showed you wagon trains from 3 miles out. She's right. He would have been. And then he would have found something that needed fixing and gone to fix it. And I would have had to tell him to eat something first. She stopped. Let the morning hold that for a moment. Then, I'm going to have to tell you to eat something first, aren't I? Rafe looked at her with the look that had been gradually replacing all his other looks over the last months. The one that was easiest to read, and that he had the least defense against. I ate, he said. When? A pause. Mae turned and went back inside to start breakfast, and Rafe followed her in, out of the September cold, and the door of the station closed behind them both, and the eastern road lay open and gold in the morning light, waiting for the next thing that was coming toward the place where someone had decided to stay. 6 months after that, in the early spring of 1,884, when the ground was just releasing its winter resistance, and the aspens were beginning the slow work of becoming green again, Mae Harding stood outside the station in the thin morning light, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the orientation of a person who knew exactly where they were, and exactly who they were in it. Not because anything had been given to her, because she had stayed long enough and honest enough and stubborn enough in the right directions that the landscape had finally caught up to what she already was. The baby was due in August. Rafe had taken the news with the stillness he took most things, and then he had gone outside and stood in the snow for a while and come back in and said, Anna, in the tone of a man, stating something that had been decided in the place where certain decisions got made. below words and before them. Mae had said if it's a girl. He had said if it's a girl. And the station sat on the northern approach to the Wyoming high country, with its door open to whatever was coming down the road. Eastbound, westbound, families and freighters and the whole restless westward motion of a country that kept moving, because moving was what it knew how to do. And in the middle of all that motion, two people had stopped, had built something, had decided, in their separate stubborn ways, that staying was the braver direction. Roy Harding's name was in a court record in Laramie now, in Morrison's journal entered as evidence, in the formal finding that Boyd Dent had been indicted on charges of criminal negligence and fraud, a finding that listed the 8 men by name, in alphabetical order, which meant Roy came 6th, and all 8 names were in the official record of Wyoming Territory, and would remain there past everyone who was alive to read them now. That was not everything. It was not Roy back. It was not 2 years unlived, but it was the truth out loud in a place that had the authority to keep it, and Mae Harding had put it there, and the morning light on the eastern road didn't ask her anything about it, just lay across the valley the way light did, indifferent and honest and entirely sufficient. She went inside to make coffee. Rafe was already at the table with a map of the summer route spread open, marking something in pencil, his tall boots still muddy from the morning's first check of the horses. The station was warm. Outside, the road was open. Whatever was coming down it, they were ready.